And I'd like to welcome you all to our very last workshop of this semester on anti-racist rhetorics and pedagogy. We have three fantastic speakers, Kelly Alvarez and Annie Bridger-Smith, my fellow ATP colleagues, and Casey Woody, fellow ATP and Assistant Director in FYC. And before I let them take over really quickly, because I have so many people here, if you have been, around a few moons here at OU and you remember a cool workshop and you would like to see a workshop like that to see again in the future, email me. We're meeting as a committee in a couple of weeks to brainstorm for topics. And I have topics down, but I want you all to get the most out of it. So please email me ideas if you want refreshers on certain things. Email me any kind of ideas for future workshops. Otherwise, you're just gonna get what I have, okay? And I don't know if that's gonna be good or not. All right, so here we go. Anti-racist rhetorics and pedagogy. I can't wait. It's all you, ladies.
Okay, before I share the slides that we've created, I want to let you know that just now I shared a Jamboard link in the chat bar. You can access it at any time. Actually, I'm going to show it to you real quick, just so that you can see what we're talking about. So we have some slides with questions on them. You can put a sticky note on here and respond to it. You can ask your own questions. Each slide is a different question. And then at the end, there's a place for questions. So if you have any questions about any of these ideas, you can put them there. We'll go through and look at those over time. So if you don't get to it today or tomorrow and it's like the weekend and you think about something, I'll check it next week. So that's there. We can always build on it. We can always come back to these conversations if you need to or want to. So that's going to be there for the foreseeable future. So we can keep building on this conversation. And then, yeah, I think that's it. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. So I'm going to mute my video because it doesn't matter anyway, right? So I'm going to share the screen for you, though. And we shall get started.
All right, Maraweka and Raibonani Atsa Annie. Or I guess some of you may know me by my government name, Antoinette, but you can all call me Annie. So one of the things that we really wanted to start with is first and foremost addressing why this workshop, Anti-Racist Rhetoric and Pedagogies, is important. So in the fall of 2020, the university released this highlight about how, if you could go back, Kelly.
Is that it?
Okay. Yeah, that's it. So in the fall of 2020, the university released a statement kind of acknowledging that the class of 2024 is one of our most diverse classes in our history, with 35% identifying as minorities, and it's a quarter of those are first generation college students. So it's obviously great to celebrate and acknowledge the diversity that we have, but we want to mostly refrain from simply acknowledging it as, hey, you exist, that's great. We want to avoid that kind of performative, again, kind of just acknowledgement, and make sure that we are addressing these aspects like systemic racism, because we are a part of an institution. And while we may not, as individuals in the department or even collectively as a department, not uphold racist tendencies, we do have to recognize that we are a part of an institution that inherently upholds racist tendencies, whether we are conscious and a factor within that or not. And so because of that, and because of our role as instructors in our classrooms and instructor to student relationships that I think a lot of us take very seriously, we have this special role to play to make sure that our classrooms, our curriculum, and ourselves are really accessible to all of our students, so that we are allowing that 35% of underrepresented students to feel like they belong, because we also want to make sure we are avoiding enforcing that kind of imposter syndrome. Sense of belonging is so integral to all students at every university, and especially here with us at OU. But our underrepresented minorities, we want to make sure that they are not feeling like they don't belong in the classroom. And that kind of comes from, again, our curriculum and how we engage with our curriculum and engage with our students. So that makes us have to confront and constantly consider how we uphold or how we are a part of a primarily white institution, going back once again to that institutional side of racism. We all obviously are going to be identifying and calling out instances of overt racism, and whether it's a conversation or a student's paper or a dialogue in the classroom, but we have to be making sure that we're looking out for those nuanced aspects as well that can lead to simply our students feeling like they do not belong. So we want to make sure that we're engaging and enforcing a classroom that shuts the door to racist dialogue, because when we don't constantly address these aspects like systemic racism and imposter syndrome, we're inherently falling into that when we don't want to be and when we're likely not trying to. So that kind of leads us to the aspect that representation, simply put, matters. Source and research after research emphasizes how mentally taxing it is to not see yourself represented, whether it's in a classroom or an institution as a whole. So especially within a English composition course, we have to make sure that we are identifying, using, and engaging with narratives that represent that statistic and not just acknowledging that that statistic exists. So that leads us to the question of how can we start applying this to our teaching? Next slide, Kelly, please. So where can we start? As I stated, as a English composition course and as nuanced as racism can be, we can start by looking at those smallest details, like our adherence to standard American English, which often prioritizes and rewards a certain white upper class way of speaking and writing. And this is obviously difficult because as an English and composition based course, we can constantly and repeatedly fall into prioritizing a certain way of writing. And we want to make sure that we are avoiding prioritizing only standard American English, because that often penalizes and discredits other ways of communicating, like African American vernacular, or even more commonly, slang. And because especially African American vernacular and slang itself, they are both valid forms of communicating. So when we're only saying that there is one way to communicate, there's only one way you're going to get these particular points on my rubric, then we are alienating those students. And we are also sometimes enforcing and almost requiring that our students code switch, which kind of falls down to they feel like they have to refrain from engaging, talking, and writing in their default method of communication. And so when we kind of have that stratification of, if you achieve this standard of speaking, you're going to be rewarded, you're going to be getting those points on the rubric or whatever, then you're saying to the other students that the way that they are engaging is not important, is not valid, and they themselves can kind of revert back into that imposter syndrome to where they feel like they don't belong in this classroom. And none of us want that. So we have to make sure that we are ourselves critically engaged with how we are suggesting our students write. And I think that one of the ways that we can do this both in 1113 and 1213 is kind of something that I think a lot of us do already. And that's kind of the aspect of genre, or at the bare minimum, making sure that our students are writing to a particular and intentional audience, which opens the door for them to engage in their default methods of communication and more kind of creative ways of communication, as long as it fits their stakeholder. But kind of making sure that we are avoiding putting our students kind of in a box to where they feel like they have to perform or look or act in a certain way to get the attention and approval of their instructors. And another way that we want to kind of examine our adherence to standard American English is kind of confronting our own implicit biases, which often comes in the form of the misdirection or kind of the equivalation of slang to African American vernacular. I think we're all very familiar with slang and the different, current and antiquated ways of using slang, but African American vernacular and other ways of communicating have rules, systems, they have structure to them. There is, a method to them. They're not just kind of happenstance. There's a long history of the way that they have been created, and they're a combination of a number of different things that we don't really have the time to get too much into today. But it is really important that we are making sure that we're not prioritizing that kind of stratification of whether or not you fall into this category, you're not as smart or as intelligent or as articulate as this other method of communication. And that really leads to how we should be challenging dominant narratives. So what I mean by this is that we want to make sure that we are exposing students to overlooked, discounted, and sometimes uncomfortable perspectives. And what I mean by uncomfortable is that whenever you are, in the kind of feedback loop of what you are constantly being fed and told is the majority, right? Whenever you are kind of exposed to something that is not what you are constantly being reinforced and told and engaging with, it can be uncomfortable because it doesn't fit what you're used to. And so I mean uncomfortable for the students because more often than not, it kind of comes from a place of ignorance. Like they're not exposed to it. Sometimes they simply don't know it exists, or sometimes they just overlook it because it does not fit the way that they engage with things or what they identify as. And so one thing that we can really do to disrupt the dominant narrative is to constantly emphasize the fact that we are on land that is not ours. And that comes from partially land acknowledgements, but in the classroom, you can ask students to text this number 907-312-5080 with their zip code. And for most zip codes, I have found that with not all zip codes it works, but with most zip codes, it'll text them back within a minute or two what indigenous lands that they are on at that current zip code. And so one thing that I really think is important is to reinforce how there are a vast number of cultures, but especially indigenous cultures on which they take part, the land as well as just the location, not maybe the physical land, but like the location of us in Oklahoma. There's over 35 tribes here in Oklahoma that we can often forget about, discount, and overlook because it doesn't fit that dominant narrative of a primarily white institution. And so sometimes it's uncomfortable to confront that we are here on stolen land, or that there are these cultures that you are kind of taught maybe like in grade school, like, hey, they exist, there's some bad things that happen, but it doesn't always kind of come into students' minds that these are living, breathing people that still exist. And so that's one way that we can kind of enforce. There are a variety of cultures that you can engage with, and especially like with location in mind, being here at the University of Oklahoma. And then another way is to really kind of draw out conversation about how our students navigate campus and our classrooms differently. In the activities archive, I've noticed mention of the Middle Ground and Jubilee YouTube videos, and I've used these a number of times in my own classroom. But if you're unfamiliar, they're videos in which there's a particular social political issue that's being talked about, and the moderators ask a number of questions, and usually the participants are standing and they kind of align in the room with how much they agree or disagree with the statement or question that they were asked. And then each of the participants goes into their own personal explanation for why they chose to align with how they did. And so not only can we allow students to view this type of material, but we can ask them to enact them in the classrooms. I've done this before, and it's resulted in a lot of really great dialogue and understanding of how students approach different concepts, topics, and just general things differently. Because one of the biggest thing that students can kind of fall into is that they are they are a monolith, kind of. We're all students here at the University of Oklahoma. And while that kind of community and camaraderie is great, it is really important that they understand that students, and especially underrepresented minority students, navigate situations and especially institutions like OU vastly differently. And that's just a really great way that you can kind of create the dialogue about it. And then lastly, what cultures are you a part of? I think that as instructors, one thing that sometimes we can try to avoid is putting the focus on us. But I think that we are a really great example of how to not only engage and incorporate critical discourse with a variety of cultures, but to also demonstrate like the importance of it. I know for myself personally, I use a lot of my own cultures in the classroom. The way that I introduced myself to you all was in my traditional language of Comanche, and I do that in my classes as well. And then also kind of throughout the semester, sometimes I will kind of come into the classroom and get class started with those types of addressments and stuff like that to constantly reinforce that we come from different worldviews, if we want to use like the terminology that our classes use. And so we can kind of demonstrate that in a way that emphasizes that we navigate campus differently, we navigate the classrooms differently, and that it's really important to not only understand that these exist, but that they should be a place for critical discourse. And so that also obviously comes in the resources that we incorporate into the classroom. You want to make sure that you are allowing students to feel represented and that you are allowing students to not have to, again, revert back into that imposter syndrome or code switching or things like that. But those are just a couple of the ways that we can work to disrupt dominant narratives in our classrooms.
So coupled with that, right, is this idea of setting an anti-racist tone in our classes. So we have to clarify boundaries. And at this point, especially if you've taught 12-13, students are a little bit more emboldened to be racist, like overtly racist in 12-13. And either in their writing or in the conversations that they have in class, right? On discussion boards, in person, whatever. I've experienced all of it. So over the time, it's like, okay, I need to like set these boundaries, but also I need to work to make sure that, like, one of the fears is that we're going to get in trouble for this, right? Like, we can't tell students that they can't say something in class, but we can. And let me tell you how, right? So the first day of class, I have a slideshow like prepared and everything, talking about like the overview of the course, what they can expect. And then we talk about like the expectations in their behavior in class and in their writing. And I include these two statements in each of these, right? They have to avoid derogatory remarks, critiques, and hate speech. If they use any of those things, if any of those things come through in their writing or in their comments, I will call them out on it. And I tell them, I call you out on this. We're going to have this conversation if this takes place in class or in your writing. And I tell them to avoid white supremacist ideas or sources when they're making their own arguments. If they're working to try to persuade a white supremacist to not be a white supremacist, right? To persuade someone against racism, then they have to look at those sources, but they're working to dismantle that. And that's completely different than employing those things and their own ideas. And I explicitly tell them they cannot use white supremacist ideas or sources in their work. They can't use those in any conversations that they have. They will, we'll talk about it if it happens. If it continues to happen, report them for violating the student code of conduct, right? So something that we read at the beginning of the semester to kind of frame this conversation as well is When Free Speech Becomes Unfree Speech by Ibram Kendi. And it's just a 2-page article. It's super short. It's accessible, right? And the premise of this article is that there's no such thing as free speech. Somebody is paying for what we say, right? So when we make racist comments, when we make hate speech, when we're engaging in white supremacist ideologies, somebody is paying for that. emotionally, physically, however, right? And so it's not really free speech, right? And in the classroom, free speech does not apply. The Supreme Court has actually upheld that hate speech, derogatory speech, any of the isms do not apply in the classroom because they do not foster a productive learning environment. And so as instructors, we can tell our students, no, you do not have the right to say that. Stop talking right now, right? We can call them out on that. And another way I kind of frame this to kind of set the tone here, right, is I use the James Baldwin quote. We can disagree and still love each other. We're not going to agree on everything, right? If we did, we wouldn't have any issues. We'd be in a utopia, right? But if the disagreement is rooted in the oppression and denial of humanity and someone's right to exist, that is not permitted, right? We cannot deny someone their basic human rights. We cannot deny someone human dignity. We cannot question someone's very existence. That is not conductive. That's not productive. It is not allowed in my classroom. And when we frame it this way, students would have to, like, if they wanted to push back against that, what's their response? Oh, no, I want to deny someone's humanity. Like, who's going to say that, right? And if they do, I mean, that's a whole other world of issues. But I think framing it this way has really helped my students see this. And I haven't had an issue this semester, right? I've had 2 students who have been talking about their stakeholders, and their stakeholders make these kinds of claims. They've had an issue clarifying that it's their stakeholder making these claims. But it's like, hey, like, we need to talk about this, right? You need to make sure that you identify this as your stakeholder's view, and let's kind of work through how this works with the issue. But none of my students have pushed back against any of this semester. And none of them have been openly racist. None of them have even been like covertly racist this semester, which is refreshing and odd in my experience. So there's a book that I read earlier in this semester. I've shared it with Casey. So I'm sure everyone at some point will be hearing about this book. It is called Black or Right? Antiracist Pedagogies, Antiracist Campus Rhetoric, something like that, right? And one of the aspects that's talked about in the book is white institutional defensiveness. And what this is when institutions of predominantly white institutions, right, historically white institutions, produce conditions that continue to place Black bodies within white institutions in precarious rhetorical binds, right? It is the systemic version of white fragility and white privilege. It is a sometimes covert, sometimes overt, right? But it's a subtle way of saying that to fit into the institution, these students have to fit into white society. They have to assimilate into whiteness, right? And that's something that we want to avoid. So in subverting white institutional defensiveness, these are some questions that we can ask, right? So these first 3 questions all come from page 78 of the Mirage book. So we should be asking ourselves as we're teaching, what texts make up the rhetorical environments of the event in question, right? What texts make up these environments of the issues or these ideas that our students are talking about? What identities and activities surround the activities that we're doing in class or the issues that our students are writing about, and how do they impinge on the ways in which its meanings evolve, right? How do ongoing activities include that text or the individuals and activities, sorry, y'all's faces were covering this up for me, and activities that the text produces or negates, right? So if we think about these questions and how they relate to our students, how they relate to what the work that they're doing, the topics that we are talking about in class, what we're writing about, all of these things, right? It kind of helps us situate and kind of realize, are we as the institution defensive about, right? Are we on guard, right? Are we reproducing harm through perpetuating subtle acts of racism or white supremacy, right? And what we want is for students to reclaim this space in white institutions. We want to allow them to resist dominant cultural forces, right? And in doing that, one thing that we can do is to allow them to write in AAVE, right? Use their language to include their identities in what they're writing, whatever shape that might take. Well, all right. So something to think about too, right? I love this chart. A lot of us are in this multicultural education bracket here, right? So we focus on celebrating diversity. We center our classrooms around creating positive social interactions across our differences. We concern our classes in exposing privileged students to diverse literature, multiple perspectives, all of these things, right? This is great. I love that we do this. We can't stop here. We have to keep going, right? If we can get to the next point so that we're exposing the social political context that students experience, right? That lets them talk about their experiences, right? We're hearing from them and not just about them. We're uplifting their voices in the classroom where they should be honored and feel safe to do so, right? We can raise other students' consciousness about inequity in everyday social, environmental, economic, and political aspects of life. We're expanding this worldview for them, right? We're giving them lenses and helping them create lenses to recognize and interrupt inequitable patterns and practices in society. That is great. We want to get to this point. Once we get here, and we start working through that, we need to keep going and push ourselves into culturally responsive pedagogy, right? So then we need to focus on improving the learning capacity of diverse students. And like Annie said, only a quarter of campus are students of color or minoritized students? That doesn't seem like a lot, but if we don't listen to what they have to say, if we don't focus on their experiences, if we don't uplift their voices in our classrooms, that number is going to go down. They won't want to be here. And in turn, we're upholding white supremacy. We're upholding institutional and systemic racism. And we don't want to do that, right? So if we can get to this culturally responsive pedagogy, then we're going to engage all of our students. All of our students will benefit from this, right? Not just students of color.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how to specifically use our curriculum to be anti-racist. And as we designed the curriculum, we really used, everyone knows this, right? And I talk about it ad nauseum, the way that we use rhetorical listening as a touchstone. But I'm going to keep pushing that and help clarify exactly how to productively and effectively use rhetorical listening and how to take into account some of the stuff that Annie and Kelly have kind of laid out for us and brought to our attention. So first of all, I wanted to call out, and Kelly provided me with this really great piece from Inside Higher Ed that it talks a little bit about research that's been done that has shown that a lot of times that the common approaches to diversity that are going on in higher education are actually reflecting the preferences of white students, right? It's actually more helpful, or it's privileging or helping out our white students. And Annie just explained, right, with statistics, 35% of our students are underrepresented or from minority populations. So we cannot just think about our white students as we do things. And I'm going to call that out for a very specific reason as I get a little bit more into depth with how to kind of bring anti-racism into the classroom. Before I get into that, though, I pulled in a couple of things from a couple of different pieces from Krista Ratcliffe, one from Rhetorical Listening and one from a chapter she has called Coming Out in another edited volume. So one, I want us to keep in mind that we're working to avoid a rhetoric of dysfunctional silence through our curriculum. So what this dysfunctional silence does is it basically puts us in a place where we quit talking, or we say we might as well just not investigate that. A dysfunctional silence, in essence, allows like white supremacy to go on, right? Because dominant discourse will always take over where dysfunctional silence exists. And so nothing is put pressure on. So we want to work against that because the dysfunctional silence will often basically keep our ears closed to marginalized voices as it relies on that guilt blame logic. And it also masks the fact that sameness and difference are kind of existing simultaneously with all of us as we come into public discourse or rhetorical negotiation. So this entire curriculum is rooted in kind of getting that out as we are teaching our students to kind of come into rhetorical negotiations. Another thing that we have to keep in mind is rather than forcing our marginalized students to entertain racist arguments in the classroom, we're wanting to use our curriculum to open doors so a woman or any disempowered, a person in any disempowered position may find their own agency to assert her voice and attempt to resist oppressive logics and cultural structures. So that's a quote that comes straight from Chris Ratcliffe's Coming Out. And I want you to think about that specifically as we engage in Unit 2. And I want to get into that a little bit more because it's so very important. But the last thing before I get to that is we want to keep in mind that socializing discourses both shape a person and afford them the opportunity to reinforce, re-advise, or interrupt identifications with discourses. So key to what I'm like laying down here is when we're using rhetorical listening and we're thinking about the way our specific curriculum was built, we want to use it to actually like make a space for our students who have been historically marginalized or underrepresented, or how the way Annie points out, right? Like certain language or language structures are not taken seriously or not rewarded in the classroom. We also want our students to be able to kind of interrupt dominant discourses. And that's where we kind of come in with 1213. But what I want to really focus on about the kind of entertaining this racist argument is I think that there is sometimes when we come into Unit 2, which is based on rhetorical listening, there's a misunderstanding that it's rooted in radical hospitality, which is every opinion matters. And if someone has a differing point of view, you ought to sit down and listen to it. But that is not what Unit 2 is about. And this is where you have to take into account that you're not talking to a monolith. Our students are not one kind of student. And I think a lot of times we see this unit as an opportunity to get our students who have been closed off to marginalized voices or marginalized experiences to open up and listen and start to think about the stake that other people have in these issues that are theoretical for them, but very like physical and real and material for others. But we also have marginalized students. 35% of our students, in fact, are. And we might have students that come into the classroom and they come in and they strongly believe in a specific, say, like part of the Black Lives Matter movement. I've had a student actually do this. When we started out Unit 2, I asked, what's something that you're very passionate about, that you have a strong opinion on? One of my students, one of my Black students, actually, she said, Black Lives Matter. I said, that is not an issue that I would take up. That's not an argument. It's a fact, right? Black Lives Matter. You are not obligated to entertain or listen to an argument that is trying to tell you that your real experiences are not real because the person making the argument has never experienced them. So I like to come back. Kelly had that great Baldwin quote, that we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity. So this is really key and important as we're bringing in that Unit 2 and 1113 in particular, that we are not asking our marginalized students to listen to arguments that come from a cultural logic of white supremacy. And if a student does pick something, it is our job as their instructor to get into the messiness of it and say, let's talk about how, like, maybe you're not obligated to listen to that argument. Is it of use? Is it denying humanity in any way? Is the person making the argument, do they have the same stake in the issue as you have it, right? So these are really important aspects to think about when you're teaching that. When we're teaching how to listen to differing points of view, it has to come with the caveat that it's not rooted in a white supremacist argument. And that is what rhetorical listening is all about. It's all about thinking about how privilege and power are affecting that negotiation. And it's not just for our white students to think about how they're in privilege. It's to allow our marginalized students to say, this person is making an argument from a place of privilege. They haven't tried to understand my material reality right now. And so we couldn't even engage in the discussion. They haven't first listened to me or tried to hear where I'm coming from. So at that point, we kind of intervene and we can sway, right? We can help them find a topic that isn't one that they shouldn't take up because it is harmful or it is rooted in oppression in some way. So that's one thing that we really want to pay close attention to as we're getting into 1113 in particular. Now, Kelly, if you want to go into 1213. So 1213 is another great place where rhetorical listening, if it's really brought in as kind of the focus, it can help us address, along with some of the tips and tools that Kelly pointed out, right? Like using that when free speech isn't free, having that statement that says like this isn't allowed. But 1213 is basically based on getting students to really kind of listen and to bring the material into the arguments that are going on. So I like to really think about the way that Ratcliffe talks about identification in rhetorical listening. So she talks about how we can make conscious identifications, which take into account the way power and privilege are kind of affecting the way we see things and how we make identifications, either with discourse or with others. But then there's also this concept of disidentification, which can be used to a productive end for marginalized groups. So disidentification can kind of say, like, that's not an accurate representation of me, so I can disidentify. The problem with this identification is can also be used by people in points of privilege to make the other abject, right? To just discount their existence or their experience. And so what Ratcliffe basically says is sometimes a disidentification based on faulty identification demonstrates why imagination alone is not enough when attempting to understand a person. In a nutshell, what this is saying is we can't just let our students or ourselves or anyone, no one should work on assumptions when they are trying to make real identifications or conscious identifications. It has to be grounded in material reality. So what 1213 does to start to create the acknowledgement of a material reality is the stakeholder analysis, right? So our students can no longer fight with straw men or employ racist attitudes if they have a certain stance, if they on kneeling or on Black Lives Matter or on a host of issues that because they have been raised in a certain way or in a place of privilege where they've never come into contact with any real oppression, that they can quickly say, well, it's not that big of a deal or the media is blowing it up, that they have to actually sit and investigate and learn and listen to people who are making discussions from the other side of the aisle to really understand that there is a material reality that's really rooted in this, and they can't just hop into a persuasive argument that's going to be problematic and it's going to be rooted in racist arguments. This is also how we kind of do help our students start working outside of a cultural logic of white supremacy. Because if they're coming in with kind of problematic stances that are innocently problematic sometimes, right? They're not overt racist. They just don't completely understand anti-racism yet, and they need a little bit of help getting there. Getting them to actually speak to effectively and ethically to a stakeholder that disagrees can be such a great way to get them to move into a different kind of value system or cultural logic. So they're making a different kind of argument suddenly that can't employ that cultural logic of white supremacy. This can also be used, this idea of thinking about the way that, or the way that like white supremacy, we want to root those out, that can be used in addressing topic selection as well, right? Or just using rhetorical listening. So if a student comes and they choose something that is pretty problematic at the time, talking to them and asking them, okay, let's think about the various stakeholders that might be here. What would their arguments be like for you? What might they say to help you understand? And how could you respond to that effectively? Is it possible? So using rhetorical listening and thinking about how you have to take into consideration material reality, and that stakes are different for different people, and to really get our students to consider those stakes can be very helpful. 1213 is also super helpful in doing the work of disrupting narratives, because, and Annie pointed this out really well, we allow our students to kind of enter into the conversation, and then they use their own language effectively, and they get to speak to someone and speak their truth in a way that they get to kind of come in and disrupt a narrative that might be overlooking something critical. Now, I'll still say the thing about 1213 is we also make it very clear that students need to pick a stakeholder that can be swayed. To someone who is completely irrational, or a out and loud white supremacist, that argument's not going to go anywhere, because that person is rooted in white supremacy. So to kind of take up that as a stakeholder wouldn't make sense, because they are purposefully and intentionally trying to espouse white supremacist ideas. And so we help our students understand too that like there are people out there that, because of the value system they're working from, or because it is rooted in overt white supremacy, that's not going to be the best way to affect change, that you get someone who can actually be a persuadable stakeholder. And that's where we can kind of start to make disruptions and interrupt these narratives that are just being taken for granted and not being pushed against. So we want to really use like our curriculum in 1213 to do these things. Another quote that I have here from Ratcliffe from her chapter that's called Coming Out is that we want to get our students to question commonly accepted patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting, and to reaffirm, resist, and or revise them, right? So 1213 should be an opportunity for our students who have not taken into account material reality to actually have to sit down and listen before they jump in and make an argument. But it also helps our students who are working to affect change to think about, how can I most effectively, who do I reach out to actually start to make change, but do it in my way with my voice, so I'm not forced into dominant discourse to do it. In fact, I can actually kind of start subverting this, and that's how I move into a place of change. So these are ways that we want to really stress, like use our curriculum to be anti-racist, right? And then Kelly, if you want to hop over to the next one. So I'm going to do some kind of just like common sense, not theoretical, just like a summary of here's some ways we might start to respond to or be proactive about racism in the classroom. So one is rooting it out, right? So set an anti-racist tone from the beginning. Kelly mentioned that she does when free speech isn't free, and that she has that, which is another bullet that I have here, have a clear class decorum statement that actually refers to the fact, right, that like certain kind of language is not allowed in the classroom. And it's been effective for her. She hasn't had any problems with students because she set the tone from the beginning that this is what's not allowed, but also why, right? And she also sets it in a positive tone that like, look, we can not agree on everything, and we can still love each other. That's fine. This isn't about rooting out any kind of resistance or difference. The thing that we're rooting out is just if there's any argument that tries to erase me or anyone else. And when you frame it like that, it's hard for a student to be like, well, no, though, I want to erase someone, right? So it sets up a tone that's like, I'm not trying to silence anyone. I'm trying to make sure that nobody is erased or going to be feel like harmed by the way you're taking up an argument. And then that's why I always use like ethics and respect. I think that the way that Kelly laid that out is a way to do that. Use ethics and respect as a touchstone, right? That this isn't about who's like, it's not a political stance, right? It's about ethics and respect. So you don't have to be overtly political. It's just about ethics and respect. And if a student wants to read ethics and respect as political, there's nothing we can do about it, right? It's our like job though to be ethical in the classroom. Calling it out is another way. If the setting the tone doesn't work and it still seeps in, call it out. Keep an eye on topics, right? Be sure that you're doing check-ins and you help students out. This can be in 11-13 when they do unit 2. So in this case, I usually look for my students who might be like entertaining the idea of listening to a problematic argument. Then I say, we don't have to listen to that. Like, that's not an argument that you have to listen to. And then in 12-13, you want to check topics from the beginning to help them maybe like steer them towards something different if they're getting into some problematic territory. Use reflection and rhetorical listening to move them into appropriate topics, right? So have them sit down with them and take the time to be like, so why is it that you want to take this argument? And what stake do you have in this argument? Why is this so important to you? Because a majority of the time when people are taking up an ism, right, an argument with racism or white supremacy at its base, if you have them sit and think about their stake as compared to others, it becomes really clear really fast that their stake is only, I want to argue and yell, right? They don't have a physical stake in it, like the people who they're arguing against. So that's helpful to use rhetorical listening and talk about stakes. And then just use the curriculum and assignment goals. You can speak back to the curriculum all the time to help sway students. I don't know if you're going to have an effective paper, if this is what you're going to take up. How are you going to convince someone who literally has to be afraid when they get pulled over that this isn't a big issue? Like, do you think that that's an argument that can be made? So you can use the actual goals to help students think through these and think about their blind spots. And then finally, I'm going to talk about FYC's role. And I also invite Amanda as our associate director to hop in at any time if you want to hear Amanda. But I want everyone to know, she's like, are you going to pull me in? Are you serious? This is your thing. I want everyone to know that you are not going to be reprimanded by FYC if you are doing things to address racism in the classroom. In fact, we want you to make sure that you have an anti-racist classroom and that every one of your students feels safe. So if you have a student who is verbalizing and articulating hate speech, you can ask them to leave. You should ask them to leave. They have created a hostile environment in the classroom and they are no longer civilly participating. So you can say, you need to leave. That is not part of class decorum. It's stated in the syllabus. I don't think many people have problems with students being like hostily. Is that hostily? Can I say that? Did I just adverb something in the wrong way? But that are hostile about it. I think a lot of times it's when students are just kind of, it's rooted in a place of ignorance, not hate or violence. But there are times that they do, and it's fine to ask them to leave. If they do it from a place of ignorance, but it's still very problematic, call it out. Right? Let it be a reflection moment. Don't allow it to just go on or slip by, because you're also setting a tone for all your other students in the classroom and you're demonstrating to them. All your students need to know that you're an ally and you will create a safe space for them and you won't allow language that's been damaging to them. So it is fine to call it out, whether it be emailing them later, doing it in the moment, but making sure that that doesn't go on. You have to gauge on a case-by-case instance, right? What's most appropriate, but absolutely call it out. That helps your student learn and grow, because a lot of times they're not meaning to do it, they just don't know better. And then no, if these things, if you're worried about these things, that it's going to come up in your evals or that a student's going to complain to FYC, we know when an eval isn't you being hyper political, it was you being protective of all of your students and not allowing these things. So you do not need to worry about repercussions at any degree in the university if you are responding to a student who is using problematic language in the classroom. So don't ever be afraid or don't feel like you can't address it in a number of ways that you feel appropriate, anywhere from emailing the student or setting up a meeting to stopping it right there in the classroom, or even asking a student to leave if they're creating a hostile teaching or learning environment. All right. Let's take a breath.
Thank you all so much. Are there any comments, questions from any one of you? We have so many people here. Don't be shy. Use the chat too if you have comments or questions for our presenters.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. So I wonder are we guilty of, was it disidentification ourselves when we are overzealous, or maybe not overzealous isn't the right word, but when we're quick to dismiss what we might construe as these harmful topics. I had a student who wrote about Daryl Davis. I don't know if you all know who Daryl Davis is, but he's a Black man who has befriended over 200 KKK members. And that's something that as a student of color, he admires that guy, and he enjoyed the opportunity to get to research him and learn about Daryl Davis's approach to talking to people who, began by hating him, but through conversation and friendship, flipped the script.
Yeah, I like that question. So what you're basically asking is are we maybe at times being a disservice to our students by not allowing them to kind of take up to see where they can go with them, or that we're too afraid that it might be racist and unproductive that we don't let them go somewhere? Is that kind of what the big question is?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the idea that there are, I guess, topics or stances that we might be a little too quick to dismiss as dehumanizing.
Yeah.
And part of that would be I'm an inexperienced instructor, so I don't know all the things that are out there that might be dehumanizing to someone. I can guess, but if someone were to say, for example, Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization,
Mm-hmm.
that has pretty clear indicators for me. That goes off. If instead someone is to say Black Lives Matter shouldn't participate in property destruction,
Mm-hmm.
Where's the line? Is there one? What do I let my students write about?
For me, in those instances, I try to meet with the student and talk through their idea to kind of see exactly where they're trying to take it and what they want to do with it. So then and through that discussion, then I can see, okay, now you're bordering on being offensive, and we can try to readjust. Or it's okay, I see where you're taking this. You just have to be careful in the way you articulate those ideas. So sometimes it's just having an extra conversation in student hours or whatever to kind of flesh out those ideas to really get a better idea and see. But Casey, you were going to say something.
I was actually, Kelly, basically going to say the same. My big go-to is also, I always talk with my students. I never assume also that they have malicious intent when something comes, because I do think a lot of I grew up in a town, I graduated with 27 people, right? It was a very tiny place. It had a very tiny mindset. I needed people to talk to me constantly when I got to college to help me. And so I think because I know that there can be these backgrounds, I never assume a malicious intent. And I do always, I'll talk to them like Kelly does, kind of figure out where they're coming from and kind of help steer a little bit, right? And then also, Blue, like you said, you have the student who's kind of looking at you know, how someone sat and talked to KKK members, which a lot of people would probably be like, you're not obligated to talk to KKK members, but it ended up being a really productive thing. If I do have a student, like when I was talking about 1113 Unit 2, like if I have a student of color who wants to, or if I have like a black male student who is like, I want to look up someone who's making the argument that like there's not a problem with like police brutality isn't a race issue, right? We sit down and talk too, and if they ultimately say no, I still want to do it, I'm like, that's like, you're absolutely, like, you get to choose, you have autonomy in this classroom. I just want us to kind of talk through it and consider, like, do you want to sit and engage with this the entire time? So I also allow the autonomy, right? And I think that the whole thing comes from always having a conversation first and never just like making a full-on assumption that we know 100% what's best for our students all the time.
I had a question when we were talking about rights. What like rights do we abide by? Like, it's not a right to, I'll just go with pronouns, right? If a male to female transgender student prefers she and somebody wants to write an article or an essay about whether that is a hate speech to call them he or not, but it's not a right in the Constitution. It's not a right in the UN or something, but people are arguing that it should be a right. What do we do with those where the debate is still out there on whether something is a right or not?
Yeah, that's a no one wants to hop in with that. I think we've actually had like a couple of things that have come up, especially because right now it's like pronouns one, also like transgender athletes. That's a big argument that seems to be kind of swallowing things up right now. But I think that that's another one that if you want to have a student that seems to be kind of arguing that they should be able to just use the pronoun that they want and disregard what like a trans individual has like the pronouns that they prefer, I would again sit down with the student and kind of talk about, right? Like, what is your stake in this? Why would you argue? Like, how is someone's pronouns affecting you in a personal way, right? And then also, because that's not really a political, like, you can't vote on pronouns so much, right? So that's another way I would use kind of like leading them in a different direction to say, this is definitely a debatable topic, but like, what is your end goal here? Just to like be able to disregard people's pronoun preference. And so I would use kind of a discussion with the student to ask them like what your end goal is. Because sometimes it is, it's like they're just engaging with it to like it's fodder when it's not fodder for other people. It's their actual like identity, you know? So I would sit again and have like a conversation and be kind with the student about it, but like help kind of lead them.
I'm not so kind.
Kelly's like, nope.
No, like if they're writing to and their goal is like, oh, I should be able to use whatever pronouns I deem acceptable for this person, despite how they identify, then they are invalidating that person's humanity and their existence, and that's not acceptable. So I tell them that. I'm like, this is what this is doing. You need to pick something else because you're not doing that.
Yeah, and did a great, again, to recall the Baldwin quote, right? Like, you can disagree with people, you can't, like, your end goal can't be like, I don't agree with your existence, right? So that's a way to kind of just nip that in the bud. And I have found when students do that, when I talk to them about it, they're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna change, right? Like, I don't even have to get to where it's like, that I kind of browbeat them. I sit down, I'm like, so this is what's going on. And they're like, oh, right. And it shifts it, so. All right, well, looks like we're out of time, huh?
I think our time is up, but thank you all so much for hosting today's workshop, and thank you all for being here. And yes, let's give our hosts some love. Let's give them an emoji or something. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.
I enjoyed this very important workshop at the end of the semester. I feel like we should have more of that kind because this feels like just the starting point of a conversation. Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Annie. It was good seeing you all. Thank you for being here, the others, and have a wonderful rest of the semester. I won't have a wonderful I will have a wonderful summer. Have a good rest of the semester, okay? You can,
And also, if y'all want to continue the conversation, go to the Jamboard.
Yes.
We can do it there too.
yes, Jamboard, absolutely.
And
You're
Silva, will you post that with this recording, the Jamboard, so people can access it in archives? And then that's where like Kelly and Annie and I can kind of hop
Would
in
be
to see
great.
if anyone has any additional.
I'll take care of that, okay? Thank you.
Casey, will you also post the I can't think of the presentation thing that y'all made?
I will.
Show?
I will. You all should check out the archive. It's all cute and stuff. I've been working on this a lot to make this digital library. Check it out sometime. Take care.
Wait,
Bye.